We think reading great Christian books is vital for spiritual growth. So we are asking significant Christian leaders which 3 books have changed their lives. Alister McGrath is the Andreas Idrios Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University and Director of the Ian Ramsay Centre for Science and Religion. He holds Oxford doctorates in the natural sciences, intellectual history and Christian theology. McGrath has written extensively on the interaction of science and Christian theology, and one of his latest books is Enriching, Our Vision of Reality.
Well, my latest book is called Enriching, Our Vision of Reality. And this is really a book that tries to say, look, there is science which tells us how the world works, and there's faith which tells us what things actually mean. And that is something which I think is really important, because when I was an atheist myself many years ago, I thought science and faith were in conflict, they were at war with each other. And one of the things I think that drew me to Christianity was this realization that it gave you this big picture of reality in which science had its place, and yet it also had its limits. And this book is really trying to say, look, science and faith can exist together, and it enriches our understanding of the world. And it's a kind of book I'd like to put in the hands of anybody who, for example, feels that science and faith can't get on together, or who's read Richard Dawkins, or who knows somebody who's a scientist who's struggling with issues of faith. This book tries to open up those questions and hopefully will give some good answers. The first book I've chosen is very predictable. It's C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's a beautifully written book, and it's a book written by somebody who used to be an atheist, who became a Christian and knew why he became a Christian. So in many ways he's engaging the real questions the world is asking and giving some very good answers. Why does it mean so much to me? Well, I like Lewis, so many people do, but this book, I think, is one of those that first made me realize you could defend Christianity intellectually, that you did not have to switch your mind off to become a Christian. And so for me, it's one of those landmarks in my own journey of faith, which has helped me to discover Christianity not simply as something that's spiritually transformative, but also that makes sense. It makes sense of me, and it makes sense of our world. That's why I like Lewis so much, and in my view, that's his best book. The second book I chose tonight is by Tim Keller, a pastor in New York, and it's called The Reason for God. The reason I've chosen this is it's a remarkably good book in its own right, but it also, I think, speaks to me very powerfully because Keller is a pastor in New York City who, in effect, has a very dynamic and very young congregation and clearly listens to the questions they're asking, the language that they're using, and in effect, this book is beautifully crafted. It's a serious engagement with questions that young people are asking in our postmodern culture and showing how the classic vision of the Christian faith is able to engage those questions and give very satisfying answers. And I admire that. I admire it for 2 reasons. One, because he does this so well, but also because he encourages his readers to listen to our culture and to work out how Christians can give good answers to those questions that our culture is asking. If we can't answer those questions, it's not because there are no answers, it's because we don't know them yet. And Keller, in many ways, is inviting us to discover them and to give them. My third choice is perhaps a strange choice. It's Marilynne Robinson's novel, Gilead. So why choose a novel? Well, I think Marilynne Robinson has, in effect, created a niche for herself. She is a theologically informed novelist who's able to use the form of a novel to open up deep theological questions, to explore them, and to begin to point towards certain answers. And the central character in this novel is an old pastor who's reflecting on deep theological issues like obligation, duty, responsibility, and in many ways he's thinking about his own faith, how it began, how it developed, and this fascinating question, how can I pass this faith on to a rising generation? And I thought it was beautifully crafted. You need to know about America to make sense of some bits of it, but it's beautifully written. And why I think I'd recommend it to others is this, because it shows you can write a novel which speaks to the imagination and the heart, but at the same time engages these deep questions. And for me, it's a book which is accessible, engaging, and asking all the right questions, and perhaps even showing there's some good answers to be had. I love reading books because, in effect, they allow me to see God, to see the world through other people's eyes. And in effect, say to me, have I seen things properly, or have I still got things to learn? It's really about being mentored by authors who I've never known, but I read their books. People who've journeyed in faith before you and are passing on to you their wisdom and asking you, does this help you in your walk of faith? Good. Well, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here, and thank Krish for asking me. And Krish suggested it might be a good idea if I talked about something about the relationship of science and faith. And particularly just to engage the question as to whether, in fact, science and religion are at war with each other, or whether God hates science, some of these slogans we find in our culture. So I'm going to talk about some of these issues in the hope that I'll, in effect, touch on some issues that you may find helpful. What you need to know is that I began life as an atheist. When I was a teenager back in Northern Ireland, it just seemed to me obvious that there was no God, that science explained everything, and I was a scientist who knew I was going to go to university and study science in even more detail, and it just seemed to me that science, in effect, gobbled up the conceptual space once occupied by God. And I think that it just seemed so obvious that perhaps I didn't actually question it quite as closely as I should. But I was a very aggressive atheist. I regarded people who believed in God as being mad or bad or sad or possibly all three. And in fact, I have to tell you that even to this day, when I read Richard Dawkins, I get all nostalgic because it kind of reminds me of my lost youth. So anyway, I went up to Oxford University to start studying chemistry in much more detail, and began to realize things were not quite that simple. I think there were two things I really want to emphasize. The first thing I began to realize was this, that atheism was not a set of certainties, though it was very often presented as if it were. It was much more, in effect, a belief system. Atheists believe there is no God, and they can't prove that is the case. Christians believe there is a God. Again, they can't prove that with absolute certainty. But I began to realize that atheism actually was a faith. And that, of course, made me begin to realize, well, of course, if it's okay to have faith, there are lots of other faith positions that need to be considered, which led me to re-examine Christianity. And so I began to rethink Christianity during my first term at university, and began to realize, I think, that Christianity gave us not simply spiritual transformation, but also this wonderful way of looking at the world, of understanding ourselves, of making sense of the world around us, and of course, of engaging God. And one of the people I discovered who helped me along the way, of course, was C.S. Lewis. And Lewis wasn't involved in my conversion, but he helped me deepen my faith, grow. He was one of these people who accompanied me as I walked on my journey of faith, and I found him to be a sort of informing and really helpful colleague as I walked along. And one of the things that Lewis says in a very good lecture he gave at Oxford in 1941 is this. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. And that's a helpful quote, because in many ways what Lewis is saying is that Christianity is like a sun rising on a dark and misty landscape. And as the sun rises, the mist begins to burn away, the shadows begin to disappear, and you can see more clearly than you otherwise would. Although, of course, Lewis is always very careful to say there will always be mist and shadows, so we don't see completely clearly. But nevertheless, the quality of vision of life that the Christian faith brings is really wonderful. And I would agree with Lewis. I think that is a very important thing to say. So that, of course, raised with me this very interesting question. I was still studying science at Oxford. I become a Christian. How did these things relate to each other? Would they have to be separate compartments of my life, which in fact I sort of held apart, or could I hold them together? And I began to think about this, and I have to say I didn't really come to any settled answers until one evening in my college chapel I heard a sermon by a man called Professor Charles Coulson, who died sadly a few years later from cancer. But he was a very well-known Methodist lay preacher and also, of course, Oxford's Professor of Theoretical Chemistry. And in a 10-minute sermon, he talked about how he held his faith and his science together. And in many ways, he gave me the toolkit I needed to kind of think this through for myself. So he began to open up this way of thinking, which I'm now passing on to you in case you find it helpful as well. What Coulson said is, look, we can think of Christianity and science as offering us different perspectives on life. So he's asking us to imagine something complex like a mountain or a big building, and you walk around it and you see it differently from different angles. And what you need to be able to do to give a total account of the building or the mountain or whatever it is to bring together all these angles, all these perspectives to see the whole thing. And Coulson's argument is that science gives you one angle of approach, one perspective on life. It's really about how things work. And that's important. We really need to hang on to that. But there is more that needs to be said. And so for Coulson, faith is all about deeper questions like meaning, values. Do we really matter? Deep questions like that. And what Coulson argues is, in effect, we can hold these things together by thinking of them as being different aspects of this greater whole. So I found that really very helpful in beginning to think about things. And it brought home to me, I think, a number of things. And one of them is that, look, of course, there can be tension between science and faith, but it doesn't need to be like that. There can be these moments in which science and faith enrich each other, allowing a deeper understanding. And so perhaps I think I could illustrate this by just giving you a very simple example from my own life. And I'm sure many here tonight could give much better examples from theirs. But this is something really happened to me, and it's this. When I was young and still an atheist, I used to look at the night sky. And I knew enough about astronomy to know that some of the stars we were looking at were very far away. And I'd look in particular at the belt of Orion, which many of you will know, and think the light coming from those stars will take, a couple of 100 years to reach Earth, by which time, of course, I'd be dead. And so for me, the night sky was a symbol of human transience, of our smallness against the vastness of the universe, our apparent insignificance. And for me as an atheist, that was very, very bleak and quite melancholy. Now, of course, I'm a Christian, and I see the same stars, but I understand them in a different way. I think of Psalm 8, which invites us to look at the heavens and remember that God made those things. And yes, what is man that thou carest for him? Well, the answer is God cares for us, that the God who made those stars and knows them by name made us as well and knows us by name. And see, this doesn't stop me saying, well, of course, I understand how those stars work physically. I understand the thermonuclear processes which lead to the production of elements in their cores, etc., etc. That's how the universe works. But there's something deeper as well. And that, I think, helps me to bring out this really important point, which is that science helps us to see how our universe works, how we work. But it doesn't tell us what the universe means or what we mean. Science is very good at telling us how we came to be here, but not why we're here. I think for each of us, that's a really important question. Social psychologists like Roy Baumeister said that the questions that really engage people deep down are things like identity, purpose, agency, can I make a difference? And values, not just how do we generate moral values, but actually, do I matter at all? And Baumeister says, look, we need answers to those questions if we are to lead meaningful lives. So one of the points I'm going to make in this talk is very simply this. To be human is to ask those deep questions about who we are, why we're here, do we really matter? And if you cannot give good answers to those questions, you're simply not going to be able to lead a meaningful life. Now, of course, someone like Richard Dawkins would say, well, you know, I mean, the universe is meaningless. There's no value. There's no good. There's no evil. There's just what he calls blind, pitiless indifference. And I say to him, well, that may be the way you see it, but that's only the way you see it. It's not a fact. It's simply your reading of the universe, and there are other ways of looking at it. And that's why I think it's very important for those of you who are in this audience who are scientists to, in effect, figure out for yourselves how best to hold your science and your faith together. Because you could be enormously important, I think, in helping others to see it can be done. There's an American sociologist called Elaine Eklund, and she wrote a whole series of articles about the relationship of science and faith, for example, how scientists respond to faith, the complexity of the questions. But one of her research papers asked this question: what is the most effective way of showing people that science and religion can be held together? And this is based on empirical research, and the answer she gave is simply this: it's not arguments, it's individual people who are able in their own lives to hold their faith and their science together. And people see that and say, they can do it, maybe we can as well. And so in many ways, I'm just saying, look, if there's anybody here tonight or watching this video, you know, who feels that could be me, you know, there's a very important role that you could play in trying to be a sort of ambassador for faith in a scientific world. So I think it's something that's very important. And of course, the whole issue of this relationship of science and faith has really become much more important because of the recent rise of what we call the new atheism. That's people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris. And in many ways, what they have done is to weaponize science, in effect to say that science is the enemy of faith, and therefore because science is good, it follows that religion is bad. Now, I personally think the new atheism is fading away, and I'm quite glad about that. But it does raise some very good questions, which I think still linger in our culture. I think what you and I need to do is to try and figure out what answers we might give to some of the questions that they are asking. For example, Richard Dawkins is saying, well, science proves things. Therefore, you Christians ought to be able to prove the existence of God. Otherwise, we just can't take it seriously. And you know, he's right in saying you have to give reasons for what you believe. And I fully accept that. But I don't think Dawkins applies his own criteria to his own beliefs. In other words, if I were to ask him, can you prove there is no God? Well, the answer is going to be, well, no, I can't. If you go online to YouTube, you may well find this very interesting video of a debate between Rowan Williams and Richard Dawkins at Oxford about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's very interesting because at one point, the conversation turns to what the evidence is for belief in God or atheism. And basically, under pressure, Dawkins, in effect, conceded he was an agnostic. That's to say, somebody who could not prove his beliefs. He was reasonably certain, but not absolutely sure that there was no God. And in effect, of course, that means he takes his position as a matter of faith. Now, I think he was just being honest. But I think what we need to keep on saying is that whether you are a Christian or an atheist, it doesn't matter whether your beliefs are religious or political or social or moral, that any beliefs that really matter lie beyond proof. In other words, you may have good reasons saying, I think this is right, but you can't absolutely prove it. For example, you can't prove that rape is wrong. You can't prove that it's wrong to oppress the poor. But I don't think that's going to stop any of us saying, well, that may be true, but nevertheless, we think there are very good reasons for thinking it is right. So that my point that I want to emphasize is that one of the tragedies of human beings is that we have to learn to live with this tension that the things that really matter in life cannot absolutely be proved. And atheists tend to present Christians as having this problem, and it's not a problem they have themselves. But actually, all human beings who believe anything are in exactly the same boat. That's very important, so you know you are not on your own. And it's a very important point to make. So let's look at a question then which Richard Dawkins raises, which I think is really interesting, and it's this. He's saying that, in effect, science, as it progresses, is simply displacing religion. Actually, science, as it advances, always comes up with answers that make religion less and less credible. And I think, I want to take that criticism seriously, but I also want to challenge it. So we're going to do a little experiment. I want you to imagine that we're here 100 years ago. In other words, we've gathered here in Cheltenham, which has been rather smaller then, and I'm giving you a lecture. I want you to imagine the lecture is on the origins of the universe. Except those of you who know your history of science would immediately say, well, you wouldn't be giving that lecture because back in 1917, the consensus was the universe has always been here, and so religious language of creation doesn't make any sense at all. Nowadays, we don't think that at all. Science has changed its mind. Quite spectacularly, the universe came into being. The Big Bang, this primordial moment when suddenly there was something where beforehand there was nothing. And of course, many atheist scientists are very, very apprehensive about this because it sounds awfully like the Christian idea of creation. But you see the point I'm trying to make. I mean, 100 years ago, people believed things about the universe which, in effect, were perhaps hostile, certainly not supportive of faith. Now, of course, things have changed, and we don't know what further changes lie ahead. There's a very famous debate in 1948, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, on BBC Radio 3. It was called the God Question, and it pitted the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell against Frederick Coppelson, who was a Christian. And they looked at a whole range of questions about God. For example, do you need God in order to defend a moral system? And Coppelson won that argument. But one of the elements was, do we need God to explain the universe? And Bertrand Russell's argument was, well, look, the universe has always been here. No explanation is necessary. End of discussion. And at the time, that was right. And the point I'm going to make is simply science has moved on. And there's been a radical change, so that 50 years later, in 1998, there was a replay of that debate, this time William Lane Craig as a Christian versus Anthony Flew as an atheist. And on that occasion, William Lane Craig said, well, look, we now know the universe came into being, so either someone brought it into being, or else it came into being by some process we do not understand and cannot understand, and began to ask Flew how he justified that and reconciled it with his atheism. And Flew found that very, very difficult. In fact, some of you will know that Flew ceased being an atheist later, although he didn't embrace Christianity, a sort of generalized theism, I think it's probably best described as. But certainly he realized that something had to change, and he moved away from his atheism. So I think we need to realize that there is something there that's very important. But there's another point I want to talk about a little bit, and it's this. One of the things that Richard Dawkins very often says about Christianity is, look, it believes all kinds of weird things. And one of the examples he gives is the doctrine of the Trinity. I mean, he says, how can any rational person believe that? And actually, I can feel a degree of sympathy with that, because when I was growing up, I lived in the Irish countryside, and occasionally we go to church on Sunday mornings, and we were one day saying the Athanasian Creed in the old version. And some of you may know this. It goes like this: the Father incomprehensible, the Son incomprehensible, the Holy Ghost incomprehensible. And there was a farmer standing beside me who was slightly deaf. And so he said very loudly, well, I think he realized it was very loud, that the whole damn thing's incomprehensible. And actually, he had my sympathy, I had to say. He had my sympathy. And actually, for me, that would have been one of the examples I would give of Christianity as unscientific nonsense. But I don't think that anymore. And actually, I think Richard Dawkins has moved on a little bit, even in his own thinking, on that question. Because Dawkins, in one of his more recent writings, in effect says, look, the human mind is just too small to take in our vast, complex universe properly. It's always going to be a mystery, something we don't fully understand. And actually, that's the point I would want to make about the doctrine of the Trinity. In many ways, what Doctrine of the Trinity is saying is this, that God is so rich, so wonderful, so vast, so glorious, that the human mind struggles to take God in. And so, of course, the temptation is to reduce God to what we can manage. So it's easy to understand. And the minute you start doing that, you begin to distort, to reduce, to diminish God. And in many ways, the Doctrine of the Trinity is trying to say, here is this enormously rich vision of God, the one who created the world, the one who redeemed it, the one who's now with us, present through his Spirit, and all of these things are true. This is all true of the one, the same God, and if we can't get our minds around it, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that we fail to understand something that is bigger than we are. And that's one of the reasons why in Christianity worship is so important, because worship in effect is almost like saying, God, you are so glorious, we simply can't take you fully in. And therefore it's not so much trying to understand you, it's trying to respond to you in adoration and worship, to recognize just how vast and wonderful you are. So for me, the Doctrine of the Trinity, if you like, is trying to safeguard this wonderful biblical vision of God and make sure we never lose it or end up reducing it to the very simple things that we can understand. But here's a question I'm sure many of you are asking, and indeed there may be some people in the audience who have come for this very reason. What sort of things could Christians say to their friends who are scientists, who are maybe skeptical, maybe hostile, maybe suspicious about the Christian faith? I'm going to just say a few things and see if any of these help you. If any of them do, please hold on to them. But if they don't help, just let them go and see if you can find something more interesting in 2 or 3 minutes while I move on to another topic. Here's the first thing I'd want to say. There are many scientists, like myself, who began by not understanding the relationship of science and faith, who in effect had bought into the dominant media narrative that science and religion are at war with each other. You need to hear me say this very, very clearly, that historians of science have basically said that is no longer acceptable. For about the last 30 years, it is categorized simply as a myth. That is not an adequate characterization of the relationship of science and faith. Sure, you can sustain that by simply cherry-picking history. But if you do it properly, it's not like that at all. Sure, there are sometimes tensions, but there are also moments of enrichment. For example, you take Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, one of the canonical works of the New Atheism. And he argues like this. Look, here's a religious writer, a man called Timothy Dwight. He opposed smallpox vaccination. That just shows that all religious writers are reactionary and backward and in effect can't cope with science. But you see, I could easily tell you 2 other stories which subvert that. Number one, the great American theologian Jonathan Edwards, who was president of Princeton College in the 1750s and wanted to persuade his students that smallpox vaccination was good and safe, and so was vaccinated himself, and unfortunately it didn't work and he died. But you see the point. That's another story which doesn't fit in with Christopher Hitchens' narrative. Or again, a more recent one. In the 20th century, in the 1930s, George Bernard Shaw, a really prominent atheist, ridiculed smallpox vaccination, in effect saying this was nonsense, a myth proposed by charlatans. In other words, an atheist opposing smallpox vaccination. You see the point I'm trying to make? And in fact, some of you may remember this too. When I was young, I used to go to my grandmother's house, and she was very, very fond of watching Dr. Finley's Casebook. And I'm sure some of you remember that. This is the old series with Janet and the rest of them. But one of the episodes was about Dr. Finley going to visit a family who refused to have their baby vaccinated against smallpox because they'd read George Bernard Shaw. So the point I'm trying to make is it's much more complicated. Second point is this. You want to emphasize that science is really great. It helps understand how the universe works, but there's more that needs to be said. We need to open up those deeper questions. What is life all about? Now, I very often find myself talking about Christianity as a kind of big picture of life. So what I want you to imagine is a big picture frame, okay? And science fills in part of that frame, but only part. And the question is that it? Or can other parts of that picture be filled in from somewhere else? And the point I'm going to try and make is that Christianity gives you this framework of meaning which helps you understand why science is so successful, but at the same time what its limits are. In other words, the areas of life that it doesn't really engage all that well. There's a book that Jeanette Winterton published recently called, it's a wonderful title, listen to this, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? It's a great title. And in this book she says, look, we've got to accept that we can't just seek food, procreate, that sort of thing. We are meaning-seeking animals. We're looking for something deeper, and it's only when we find that we really start to live. And science doesn't deliver that. You need to find that somewhere else. And again, Albert Einstein, in the wonderful lecture of 1939, said that the real problem is that science is simply helping us understand how the various elements of the universe interrelate with each other, but deeper questions remain unanswered. And because we're human beings, we want answers to those deeper questions. And that really is where Christianity comes in and begins to open up this rich vision which helps us make sense of science, but also engages those questions of who are we? Do we matter? Why are we here? That, I think, is a very important point to make. And the third point I want to make is very, very simple, but I think also very important. And it's this. It's picking up on Psalm 19, verse 1. I'm sure many of you know this very, very well. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And in many ways, it's saying, look, you look at the night sky, and it's wonderful. It's overwhelming, in fact, at times. And the scientists can help you understand, what the stars are doing, how they came to be there, and various things like that. But the psalmist is clearly saying there's more to it than that. That in some way those stars are reflecting the glory, the brilliance of God himself. And one of the points I want to emphasize is that the scientist can look at the stars and see them as a scientist, but then you can almost put on a pair of spectacles and have stereoscopic vision. Not just how things work, but something deeper, what they mean, what we mean. And so the point I'm going to suggest is that maybe loving science and loving faith gives us this stereoscopic vision. It allows us to have depth in the way in which we read our world and ourselves, but in effect bringing God into it and finding that things are changed. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be said, but I think I need to just begin to wrap up things this evening. Obviously, I've been talking a bit about a number of questions in relation to science and faith, but I think the main point I want to make is simply this, that sure, you can present science and faith as if they are in tension, but really it doesn't have to be like that. We don't really believe that there is any right relationship between science and religion anymore. That was sort of what previous generation thought. Nowadays we tend to think actually it's up to us to figure out what we think that relationship is. And so in many ways, I think each of us is being invited to think about how we might hold these together, how they might illuminate each other. I've tried to do that, and I'm sure many of you here tonight have done that as well. And so in many ways, what I'm suggesting is that sometimes when people ask you about these questions, you can give somebody else's answer. But it's always good if you have your own answer, something you've thought through and feel comfortable with. And really, that's why I suggest we need to think about doing, just encouraging each of you to think through how you personally might relate science and faith, and then help others to see that as well. It's really important, I think. So let me end by talking about an Oxford biologist called Sir Peter Medawar. He was a sort of rationalist, he was a secularist, But he also was very, very clear about the limits of science. He won the Nobel Prize for Medicine back in 1960-something. And in his final book, with the significant title, The Limits of Science, he's just reflecting on his long life as a scientist and some of the conclusions he's come to. And it's this. He's saying there are some questions which are real questions, which matter profoundly to people. What the philosopher Karl Popper calls ultimate questions, deep questions. Examples: what is good? Why are we here? What are we meant to be doing? And his point is simply this. Look, I'm a rationalist. Science can't answer these questions, and in fact, no conceivable advance in science would allow you to answer these questions. But as human beings, we need answers if we're going to really become happy, well-balanced people. And he says, therefore, we've got to look to metaphysics and religion, not to contradict science, but rather to fill in those really big areas of that big picture which we need to fill in. And so what I want to do is suggest that in many ways, one of the things that you might be able to do, even if you don't feel entirely confident about the science, is to say, well, of course, I'm a great admirer of science, but there's some questions it just seems to me science doesn't really engage with. And there are these deeper questions. Sure, science takes things apart and lets us see how they work, but we need faith to put them back together again and see what they mean. And in many ways, what I'm doing is handing this over to you and saying that each of you can really begin to have some very good conversations about the need for meaning, the need for value in life, and explain how your faith really does that. And hopefully that will open up some very interesting conversation with many scientists who love science, but know there's something missing from that big picture. And that's, I think, where you come in and move that conversation on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.